Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Tuesday night. Let's light up the darkness. Okay. Who is with us? Paul in the Great Northwest, Joe in the Inland Empire, Paul says Erev Tov, Jonathan in Southern California, Joseph in Massachusetts, Sam in Central Virginia, Lucy in Minnesota, Guy in Ohio. And over there on the YouTube side, Lynn in North Texas. Welcome, welcome everybody. We are in chapter 6 of Tractate Nazir, still discussing Mishna number 1. Our daf is Lamed Vav. Lamed Vav is a nice number, 36, not just double chai, twice 18, but Lamed Vav. When you talk about the Lamed Vavniks, right? There's this tradition that there are 36 righteous people in the world, but for these incredibly righteous and hidden souls, we'd have another destruction of the world like the flood, because there's so much evil in the world. But thank God, among us there are people here and there hidden who are just utterly righteous people, and the tradition says that the world stands for them. Okay, we are picking this up at the bottom of page 35b, continuing our discussion. So we've been talking about, we got kind of deep into the weeds on how the rabbis interpret biblical verses where there's, so to speak, extra words, and the Torah doesn't have any extra words. So that's why when these seemingly additional phrases, it invites the rabbis to derive additional laws that were intended to be derived. The oral tradition was always intended. God gave the beginning of the oral tradition to Moses with a few oral laws given at Mount Sinai, and a procedure, a method, a tradition that was begun there, by which, our elders, the wisest among us in every generation, would discuss and debate and figure out, right? And once a precedent was established, it doesn't get changed, but the oral tradition is there to help us answer new questions that weren't around back then. And new technology brings new issues all the time. So we were looking at these interpretive principles, hermeneutical principles, and comparing one principle, generalization, detail, generalization, compared to another principle, which is restriction, amplification, restriction. And the bottom line was that in a debate between Rabbi Nazir and the majority of the rabbis, the majority always wins, the majority came out with that a Nazir, when he takes his vow of Nazirus, he is prohibited to eat the produce of the grapevine. And what is the produce of the grapevine, or even the produce of the produce? It's the fruit and what comes from the fruit, right? To the exclusion from the prohibition of the leaves and branches, right? Rabbi Nazir said that if a Nazir eats leaves and tendrils of the grapevine, he would have violated his oath of Nazirus. And the majority said, no, what we're talking about is fruit, right? And we went through a whole derivation of that. So we're continuing this discussion now, not so much about these hermeneutical principles, but something a little bit related to, he's not allowed to eat grapes, clearly. Not grapes, not raisins, not wine, not grape juice, not vinegar, not brandy made from grapes. We've talked about he becomes liable if he eats 2 seeds and a grape skin. That's like eating a grape. And what other kinds of minimum measures would lead to liability for one who took the oath of Nazirus to have violated it? Now, no one forced the Nazir to take that oath, but once he did, he is bound by it. Okay, so we pick this up, like I said, at the bottom of 35b, where Rabbi Abahu says that Rabbi Yochanan says, with regard to all prohibitions that are written in the Torah, and now this starts to get quite relevant to ourselves and our lives, with regard to all prohibitions that are written in the Torah, a permitted substance does not combine with a forbidden substance. If one eats a permitted food with a forbidden food, and together they constitute the minimum prohibited measure, he is exempt from punishment for this act of consumption. Right? So bottom line there is when you're eating a prohibited food, and different prohibited foods have different minimum requirements, but what it means is that kind of in a general case, something that's prohibited to eat, if you eat a tiny amount of it, you don't become liable to transgressing that law because it was a de minimis case. Now, on Passover, if you eat any chametz, there is no minimum. Any chametz is bad, right? To have it in your possession, to eat it, to use it. But normally, something that's prohibited, you have to eat more than a grain, right? More than a crumb to become liable for violating that prohibition. So in the case of a Nazir, how much product of the grapevine, right? How much product of grapes does he have to consume in order to become liable for violating that prohibition that he imposed on himself when he took the oath of Naziris? And we've already seen that it's an olive bulk, right? So these kinds of Talmudic volumes often speak of a lentil or a barley corn size, an olive bulk, an egg bulk, and then we get to larger volumes than that. So the olive bulk is the minimum volume that you'd have to eat of produce of grapes to become liable. Now, what they're asking is, well, wait a minute. What if you take some grape juice and you drop a little bit of grape juice on for a Nazir that's prohibited, and he puts that drop on something that is otherwise permitted, like a piece of bread, right? So if he puts a drop of wine onto more than an olive bulk of bread, right? So he only had one drop of wine, but the thing that he ate, right, was this bread. Let's say that it was soaked in wine and absorbed less than an olive bulk of wine, but enough so that the whole bread had some wine in it. So did he violate his oath of Naziris? The bread and the wine combined to form larger than an olive bulk, but the amount of wine in this mixture is less than an olive bulk. And so the sages are asking, did this person violate his oath? So they say, so Rabbi Bahu says that Rabbi Yochanan says, with regard to all prohibitions that are written in the Torah, a permitted substance does not combine with a forbidden substance to make up the minimum volume. And if he eats this mixture that contains less than the olive bulk of the prohibited substance, he is exempt from punishment for this act of consumption. Now, this principle applies to all laws except for the prohibitions of a Nazir. So in other areas of the law, this guy would be exempt, but a Nazir would actually be liable. Why? This principle applies to all laws except for the prohibitions of a Nazir, who is liable for eating a mixture of that kind. Why? Because the Torah said, with regard to a Nazir, Numbers 6:3, neither shall he drink anything soaked in grapes. And this verse indicates that a Nazir is prohibited from consuming not only wine and vinegar, but also any food that was soaked in these liquids in any amount. So Zeri says, permitted and forbidden substances combine. In other words, it still has to be an olive bulk, but even though there's less than an olive bulk of wine in that mixture, he's going to be liable because it said that the Nazir cannot consume any food even soaked in wine or grape juice or vinegar from grapes. Now we're on 36a. So Zeri says, permitted and forbidden substances combine with regard to the prohibition against offering leaven on the altar as well. Right? So this is another area of law. You just said that the only area of law where they do combine to fulfill the minimum measure that would render one liable is for the Nazir, and everywhere else they don't. But Zeri says, wait a minute, there's another area of law where we see the same idea. And this is the prohibition against offering leaven on the altar. So when the temple is standing And the Mizbeach, the altar, is in the temple where we bring the sacred offerings, animal offerings, meal offerings, libations, sprinkling blood of an offering, etc. So one of the laws of the altar is that you may not bring any leaven or honey onto the altar, right? And so this verse, Leviticus 2:11, it says, "For any leaven and any honey shall be offered as a burnt offering before the Lord." And then it goes on to detail that, you can't do it. So this indicates that one is also liable for sacrificing leaven in a mixture in addition to the liability for sacrificing pure leaven. Right? What is leaven? Chametz, right? Like leavened bread, bread that rose, that you can't eat at Passover. And basically bread, in the meal offering that's brought on the altar, it can never have yeast or any kind of leavening in it. It was a flatbread, right? It was always a flatbread that was brought as part of a meal offering. So this indicates that one is also liable for sacrificing leaven in mixture in addition to the liability for sacrificing pure leaven. Now the Gemara asks, in accordance with whose opinion did Zeri issue his ruling? It is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, who derives from the term kol, which we translated as any leaven, any honey. Kol, leaven, kol, honey. Now, kol sometimes means all, but in this case, it means any. So the Gemara says, in accordance with whose opinion did Zeri issue this ruling? It is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, who derives from the term kol. In the verse, you shall eat nothing leavened at Passover, right? All leavening is prohibited to you. That a mixture with part leaven is forbidden on Passover. Now the Gemara raises a difficulty. Well, if so, with regard to the matter of leavened bread on Passover, and there's already a Passover section in the supermarket, don't get nervous. The spring cleaning of our homes, getting rid of all chametz, is around the corner. If so, then with regard to the matter of leavened bread on Passover, one should also be liable for eating leaven combined with a permitted substance. For example, less than an olive bulk of bread soaked in wine, so that the volume is now an olive bulk. And the Gemara answers, yes, indeed it is so. Rather, when Zeri specifies that the prohibition applies with regard to sacrificing leaven in offerings, he meant to exclude the statement of Abaye, who says there is significance to sacrificing less than an olive bulk of leaven on the altar, i.e., one is flogged for sacrificing an offering of that kind, even though it has less than the minimum measure. By noting that one is liable due to the fact that permitted substances combine with forbidden substances, Zeri teaches us that there is no significance to sacrificing less than an olive bulk, and therefore this is not punishable by lashes. Now, Rav Dimi sat and stated this law of Rabbi Yochanan, that a permitted substance does not combine with a forbidden substance, except in the case of a Nazir. And Abaye raised an objection to his opinion from a Mishna that we find in tractate in the order of the Mishna Tevel Yom, in a case where the thick soup was made, where the thick soup was made with produce that had the status of teruma, but the garlic and oil therein were of non-sacred produce. Okay. There's a whole bunch of little concepts that we need to understand here. Teruma we've talked about. Teruma is a tithe that's given to a priest, right? So a farmer, when the temple is standing, sets aside teruma, the first 2% of the crop, and he gives it to a priest. And once it's set aside as teruma and given to the priest, that is sacred produce, right? Only a priest can eat it, and both the teruma and the priest who's eating it must be in a state of ritual purity, must be tahor. Otherwise, the teruma is disqualified and no one can eat it. Right? So a priest can give teruma to members of his household, but otherwise a non-priest cannot eat it. And it has to be in a state of purity. Okay? So here we're talking about a tevel yom. A tevel yom is somebody that was tameh, became ritually impure, Perhaps he walked into a cemetery, became impure for the dead. Perhaps he came into contact with a sheretz, a dead creeping thing. Perhaps he was a metzora, somebody who was suffering from tzara'as, or who came into contact with a metzora, etc. Right? So there's different ways that you could become impure. Once a person becomes impure, even if he's a priest, he can no longer eat teruma. What does he do? He has to go through a purification process. Depending on the kind of impurity is the type of purification that he has to go through. And once he finishes his purification process, the last step is always immersing in the mikveh. And then he has to wait for nightfall, right? So once he's immersed, basically he's finished his purification. He's done everything he needs to do. He immersed in the mikveh, the ritual bath. But he still has to wait for the day to end, for nightfall to arrive. The new day comes, and at that point, he becomes qualified to eat holy things again. So even though he went through the purification and immersed in the mikveh, he's not permitted to touch that food or eat it until nightfall comes. So one who has completed the purification and is awaiting the end of the day, this person is called a tevel yom. Finishes purification, he's awaiting the end of the day. So in this law that Rav Dimi is bringing, Rav Dimi brought this idea of Rabbi Yochanan, who says that permitted and forbidden substances do not combine to form the minimum measure, except in the case of a Nazir. And Abaye is raising an objection based on this principle that a tevel yom, right? He's awaiting nightfall, so that he's a priest. He became impure. He's gone through his purification, and now he's awaiting nightfall so he can start eating teruma again. But until nightfall comes, he's considered still impure. And if he touches food that is teruma or has teruma in it, he's going to disqualify it. Okay? So Abaye raised an objection to this from the case of the tevel yom. So in a case where there was thick soup, and it was made with produce that had the status of teruma. So the thick soup was teruma, was made of teruma, but in the teruma was mixed garlic and oil that were chulin, non-sacred. And one who was ritually impure and who immersed that day and is waiting nightfall for the purification process to be completed, the tevel yom, and he touched some of the contents of this thick soup. So he has disqualified all the contents of the pot from being eaten, because that soup is considered teruma soup, since the majority of the soup is teruma. However, if the thick soup was made with produce of non-sacred status, but the garlic and the oil had the status of teruma produce, right? So the minority of the thick soup was teruma, most of it was non-sacred, and then the tevel yom touched it. So then he has disqualified only the part of the thick soup, and this is why we're talking about thick soup, that he touched, right? The part that he touched, we could scoop that out, get rid of it, and then the rest of the pot is still qualified. Whereas if it was mostly teruma and he touched it, then all of it is disqualified. So now Abaye, furthers his objection. And we discussed this, Abaye says, and we discussed this issue. Why are the contents in the place that he touched disqualified, right, when the majority is not sacred, but some of it is sacred? So since the primary ingredients of the dish are non-sacred produce, it should not be disqualified by contact with one who immersed himself that day, but is awaiting the end of his purification at nightfall. And Rabba Bar Bar Chana says that Rabbi Yochanan says, what is the reason that the contents become disqualified? It is due to the fact that a non-priest is flogged for eating an olive bulk of the soup, as anything into which teruma is mixed is considered teruma by Torah law. So Abaye concludes his objection. What is Rabbi Yochanan's reason that a non-priest is flogged for eating this mixture? And now we're on 36b. Is it not due to the fact that the permitted substance combines with the forbidden substance? And this would mean that this principle applies in other areas of Torah law besides Naziris, right? Remember that in this thick soup, there's non-sacred produce and sacred produce that are combined. So so if this guy touched it, what did he touch? Did he touch an olive bulk? And then this olive bulk that he touched is made of a combination of sacred and non-sacred. In one case, mostly non-sacred. In the other case, mostly sacred. So even when it's mostly non-sacred and he touches it, he disqualifies that area. So it must mean that that little part that he touched, even though it has only a small percentage of it is sacred, it must be that it combines to become like something sacred, right? So Rav Dimi said to him, no, you're wrong. It's not that they combine to form the minimum measure. What is the meaning of an olive bulk in this Mishnah that you're bringing? It means that there is enough teruma in the mixture so that when one eats from the mixture, he will consume an olive bulk of teruma in the time it takes to eat half a loaf of bread. Meaning that there's a lot of teruma in it. It's not some tiny little minuscule measure. It's that if you're eating soup and you're going to eat, you're going to eat an olive bulk of that soup. Well, it must be that there's an olive bulk, that there's enough teruma in the mixture, so that when one eats from the mixture, he will consume an olive bulk of teruma in the time it takes to eat half a loaf of bread. So this half of loaf of bread has nothing to do with the volume that we're talking about. The half a loaf of bread is actually a measure of time. How long does it take to eat half a loaf of bread? Anywhere from 3 to 9 minutes. Half a loaf of bread is defined as approximately 3 egg bulks. Some say 4 egg bulks. But the idea, this often comes up as a measure of time when we're talking about eating substances that are permitted or prohibited, right? So the minimum measure is like, let's say, the olive bulk, but you have to eat that olive bulk in a certain amount of time, right? If you space out this eating of the olive bulk over a whole day, even though you ate an olive bulk, you didn't eat it in a short enough amount of time that it's considered one act of eating. It was spaced out, and so it's not one act of eating. So the time it takes to eat half a loaf of bread is what we're talking about. Let's call it, just for argument's sake, 3 minutes. So if you were eating this thick soup at a normal rate for 3 minutes, you would in that time have consumed an olive bulk of teruma. It's not that when you took an olive bulk of the thick soup that there was an olive bulk of teruma in it, because there's not. The minority of that soup is teruma. But if you're eating it for 3 minutes, you would have consumed this olive bulk of teruma, the sacred produce, and if you're not a priest, now you are liable for violating the prohibition. So Abaye said to him, but is eating an olive bulk of this mixture in the time it takes to eat half a loaf of bread, is this prohibited by Torah law? And is one flogged for it? And Rav Dimi said to him, yes. What's the difference between Torah law and rabbinic law? Right, that in cases of uncertainty, we're lenient if we're violating a Torah law. We're lenient if we're violating a rabbinic law, and stringent if we're violating a Torah law. Right? So Abaye says to him, is eating an olive bulk in the time it takes to eat half a loaf of bread, is that prohibited by Torah law? Right? And he's asking rhetorically, because he's saying this whole idea of eating half a loaf of bread, and now we're into the weeds, this must be a rabbinic law. But Rav Dimi says to Abaye, yes, it is a Torah law. So Abaye asks in response, well, if so, why do the rabbis disagree with Rabbi Eliezer with regard to eating Babylonian kutach, which is a dip? It's another kind of mixture. We were talking about a thick soup that might have had some teruma mixed into it. Now we're going to talk about Babylonian kutach. So kutach is a dip, right? And this dip has chametz in it, right? Has bread in it. So this dip, what if you eat it on Passover, right? It has some chametz in it. How much is the minimum amount that you're going to be liable for violating Passover? So the rabbis maintain, the majority maintains, that one is not punished by Torah law for eating a mixture that contains leaven. Although the rabbis do not derive from the term nothing, now you're translating the word kol as nothing. Sometimes it means all, sometimes it means any, now it means none. That leaven in a mixture is forbidden. they should nevertheless hold one liable for eating an olive bulk of forbidden substance in the time it takes to eat half a loaf of bread, right? Minimum measure, minimum time. So Rav Dimi said to Abaye, leave aside the case of Babylonian kutach, as there is no possibility that one will consume an olive bulk of the leaven in the time it takes to eat half a loaf of bread. If he eats kutach in its pure, unadulterated form, by swallowing it as food rather than dipping his crackers or bread or something else into it, so then his intention is rendered irrelevant by the opinions of all other people. Why? Because it is unusual for a person to eat a pungent dip by itself. Right? We're thinking all kinds of jokes here, but yet if you think of something really spicy like schug, right? No schug for you. Or you're thinking, whatever your favorite hot sauce is. Like, it's very unusual for a person to consume hot sauce as food. You sprinkle your hot sauce on other foods. You dip a food into hot sauce. You don't just take a spoonful of hot sauce. So you're not going to get an olive bulk of leaven, which is the little bit of, say, breadcrumbs that are mixed into kutach. You're not going to get an olive bulk of leaven by eating kutach, because kutach itself is just, a spice. You don't eat it by itself. Okay? So hopefully this is clear. And so you're never going to get to that volume of the olive bulk of leaven by eating kutach, because there's so little leaven to go around in the amount of kutach that a person would normally consume. Right? The rabbis maintain that one is not punished by Torah law for eating a mixture that contains leaven, although the rabbis do not derive from the term nothing that leaven in a mixture is forbidden. They should nevertheless hold one liable for eating an olive bulk of forbidden substance at the time it takes to eat half a loaf of bread. And Rav Dimi says to Abaye, leave aside kutach, because there's no possibility that somebody would eat that much leaven when they're eating kutach, because kutach does not get eaten by itself. It is unusual for a person to eat pungent dip by itself. One receives no punishment for conduct that is anomalous like this. And if he dips other food into the kutach and eats it, he will not be found to have consumed an olive bulk in the time that it takes to eat half a loaf of bread. Due to the pungency of the dip, one typically adds only a small portion of it to his food, like hot sauce. So Abaye raised an objection to Rav Dimi from a baraisa with regard to two mortars. One used for teruma spices and one used for non-sacred spices, before which were two pots, one of teruma produce and the other of non-sacred produce. And the contents of these mortars fell into the pots. But it is unknown which produce fell into which pot. Right? Did the non-sacred mortar, the stuff in the non-sacred mortar fall into the non-sacred pot, or did it fall into the sacred pot? Right? Was non-sacred food mixed with sacred food or not? We don't know. That's the issue. So in that situation, the contents of both pots are permitted. The pot containing the teruma produce is permitted for a priest, and the pot containing non-sacred produce is permitted for all. Why? This is because I say, with no definitive proof to the contrary, that the non-sacred spices fell into the non-sacred produce, and the teruma fell into the teruma. We don't know which fell in. We have a case of uncertainty, but we don't have evidence that the sacred was disqualified. We just know it might have been disqualified. It was 50-50. So Abaye explains his objection. And if it would enter your mind to say that eating an olive bulk of forbidden substance in the time it takes to eat half a loaf of bread is prohibited by Torah law, why do we say this principle? Because I say there's no evidence, right? If it was a Torah law that was being violated, we need to be stringent. And if the possibility exists that the 50-50 possibility that the non-sacred fell into the sacred, that would disqualify all of the sacred, and a priest could no longer eat it. But since we don't say that, since we don't rule stringently, since we rule leniently, it must be that the law that's being violated is a rabbinic law, right? Where in cases of uncertainty, we are lenient. And Rav Dimi said to Abaye, rather, what will you say? That the permitted substance combines with the forbidden substance? But if so, one can still ask why we use this principle of because I say that there's no evidence that the sacred mixed with the non-sacred. Rather, leave aside the case of teruma separated from spices, which is teruma by rabbinic law. right? Teruma is something we separate from grain, from, stuff we grow in the field, produce. Teruma of spices that we grind in the mortar is by rabbinic law. The Torah doesn't say anything about taking teruma from spices. Teruma is meant more for grain, right? The kinds of grain, wheat, barley, oats, spelt, etc. That we'd separate teruma from spices, we do it, but that's by rabbinic law, not by Torah law. So Abaye raised another objection to Rav Dimi from a similar baraisa. There were 2 baskets, one filled with teruma and one filled with non-sacred produce. And before them were 2 containers, each containing a sa of produce, one of non-sacred and one of teruma. And these, the contents of the baskets, fell into the bigger containers of produce. Okay, so you said it was because taking teruma from spices is by rabbinic law, not by Torah law. Okay, well now there's another baraisa that talks about grain, not spices. And we still have the same idea that if some non-sacred produce and some sacred produce were in baskets and they fell into large containers that had, larger amounts of produce, and we're not sure whether the sacred mixed with the non-sacred or not, if we still have this same principle that we can't assume it was ruined, we don't have evidence that it was definitely ruined, and so we're going to be lenient, it must be that we're being lenient in the case of rabbinic law, not Torah law, otherwise we'd be stringent. And so Abaye explains, and if it would enter your mind to say that eating an olive bulk of forbidden food and the time it takes to eat half a loaf of bread is prohibited by Torah law, why would we say? Because I say the non-sacred produce fell into the non-sacred produce. Why are the sages not concerned that one might eat an olive bulk of teruma in the time it takes to eat half a loaf of bread, which is prohibited by Torah law? Now, granted, according to my opinion, as I say that this is because permitted food combines with forbidden food, I can explain that this is referring to a case where there is more non-sacred produce than teruma. And the combination, I'm almost done. Get your questions in. And the combination assumes the status of the forbidden item or teruma only when those are in the majority. However, says Abaye to Rav Dimi, according to your opinion, that you say this is because there is an olive bulk consumed in the time it takes to eat half a loaf of bread, then even if there is more non-sacred produce, what of it? In any case, there is an olive bulk of teruma eaten within the time it takes to eat half a loaf of bread. What they're arguing about is, are we saying that you violated the law because while you were eating something that is majority non-sacred but has some teruma in it, that the amount of, and you're eating at a normal amount of time, that over the course of that time you will actually eat an olive bulk of teruma? Or are we saying that you violate this prohibition because the permitted and or the sacred and non-sacred combine, and as soon as you've eaten an olive bulk of the combination, you have violated the prohibition? That's the cliffhanger. Discussion continues tomorrow. Okay. Where are we with questions and comments? On Nazir 36. Nina's reminding me to remind you that on Purim Day at noon, which is next Tuesday, we'll do our annual Megillah reading in English, reading the book of Esther at noon Pacific in English. Nina's saying there's no comments or questions because it's quite confusing. Okay. There we go. Sometimes you got to just sit back and enjoy the ride, and maybe by tomorrow it'll become clearer. That's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Wednesday, 6 p.m. Pacific, for Nazir 37. Have a great night.